Do you love records? How should you nurture that love? Welcome to Lancaster Hi-Fi. Pour yourself a glass and let's talk records. I'm drinking Dalwhinnie today in my Dalwhinnie glass, which I got at the distillery. Cheers. So let's talk records. Vinyl records. LPs and 45s. 7 inches, 10 inches, and 12 inches. How should you buy them? How should you listen to them? How should you care for them? And how should you store them? And, by the way, how should you transport them? Different people do different things differently. Duh. So I'm going to tell you how I do them, what I learned from my father, who began collecting records before they were made of vinyl, and some other practices which I'll comment on. I grew up in a house full of records. See those 2 cabinets? When my father passed away in 1987, he had 14 of these, plus about 1 more cabinet's worth of overflow in a built-in cabinet in the house, all full of records. And he had 10 or 20 in his office. He would have records shipped to his office and bring them home a few at a time in his briefcase. My oldest brother began collecting records in the early 70s with early Allman Brothers, Chicago, and Blood, Sweat, and Tears. From there, he moved on to prog, King Crimson, Genesis, Gentle Giant, Yes, and Pink Floyd, among others. I started collecting records in 1980, I think, when I got my first all-in-one stereo. Record player, tape deck, and tuner all in one unit, plus speakers in the box. It was crap, but it initiated a period of obsessive record buying that lasted until 1990 or so, when records, especially new releases, got a lot harder to find. More recently, I started buying records again in 2020. Now, in the early 90s, I didn't stop buying music, I just bought a lot of CDs. Before both of my older brothers left for college by the time I was 10, I enjoyed listening to their music. When my older brother got Interview by Gentle Giant, my favorite song was I Lost My Head, I think. It was a long time ago and I was 9. When he listened to music in his bedroom next door after my bedtime, I always requested Todd Rundgren. When my brothers moved out, they took their stereos and their records, and I was left with a radio. FM stations in Fayetteville, Arkansas did not play much prog in the late 70s. So my brothers took my favorite music with them. When I started buying records then, I was trying to replace the music they had taken. Hell, I'm still doing that. In the early 80s, though, I largely shifted my record buying to punk and new wave. Whereas Pink Floyd and Gentle Giant had been my favorites, Talking Heads, Elvis Costello, and R.E.M. were my new favorites. When I went to college in Boston in the mid-80s, my buying gradually shifted to mainly alternative rock. And my favorite bands were Government Issue, Game Theory, and the Butthole Surfers. Around the same time I stopped buying records and started buying CDs, I started mainly buying hip-hop, funk, and acid jazz. And my favorites were Brand Nubian, Jungle Brothers, and Incognito. Nowadays, I'm mostly buying old rock music that my snobbery and tribalism wouldn't let me fully enjoy back in their day. Buying records started out, and remains, as treasure hunting. Ooh, looky there. I want to listen to that. Generally, I don't seek out special or original pressings because I'm trying to satisfy my craving for music, and the package and provenance are a distant secondary and tertiary, respectively. Provenance. As I've said before in a previous video, I love album art, but it's a bonus to, not a goal of, my purchases. My first piece of advice then is this. Buy what you want to listen to. Your primary goal should be to find music you love, but don't be afraid to try something new or that you're not sure you'll like. Not every record can be a favorite, and there's value in adding breadth to your collection or satisfying your curiosity. Once my records are home, where do I keep them, and how do I choose what to play? I keep records in 3 places, or 4 right now because I've got 2 turntables in regular use. New records go next to the turntable. Probably shouldn't set glasses on your turntable. Rules are made to be broken, especially when it's really good scotch. These are the records in heavy rotation, and they're kept in order of newest and last played to older and less recently played. This stack also includes records selected from the cabinets, which contain records in light rotation. I'd keep all my records in cabinets if I had enough of them. The records in cabinets are separated into genres, sort of, and alphabetized by artist within genres. The top cabinet is mostly rock, but also funk, soul, R&B, and hip-hop. These are, with a few noteworthy exceptions, records that I bought. The bottom cabinet is mostly jazz, then some classical and Hawaiian, plus the Alice collection at the end. These are, with a few exceptions, records that I culled from my father's collection. I have bought a few classical records since 2020. Every once in a while, I take records out of heavy rotation and put them in the cabinets. A bit more often, I select a few records from the cabinets and put them into heavy rotation. Since I prefer to keep the cabinets exactly full, I generally put about the same number of records back into light rotation. That is, heavy rotation predominantly comprises recent purchases, where recent could be 2020, but also older records, where older means before 2020, selected from the cabinets. Some of those older records will be moved from light and into heavy rotation, and swapped for older records that are moved back into the cabinets, out of heavy and into light rotation. Occasionally, I'll move a larger number out of heavy rotation and into light rotation to make room for new purchases. Since I keep the light rotation cabinets just full, I also have to move a similar number of records out of light rotation and into the crates. Well, technically, they're boxes. The crates contain the overflow, the records that won't fit in the more accessible locations. While I've got the crates open, I typically choose a few and move them into light rotation, which means pulling a similar additional number out of light rotation. In summary, new records always go into heavy rotation. Records frequently move back and forth between heavy and light rotation. Occasionally, limited space requires taking a bunch out of light rotation and putting them into the crates, at which time I might also move some out of the crates and into light or even heavy rotation. Whew! Is that complicated? Records I listen to all the time. Records I listen to not as much. In the crates go records I hardly ever listen to. And there are even records in there I've never listened to. This system works for me, and it's similar to what my dad did, although his new records typically went immediately into the cabinets or overflow, that is, separated into genres and alphabetized by artist within genres. And his heavy rotation was generally a short stack, say 10, taken from the cabinets and played only once before returning to the cabinets, at which time Dad would select another stack of 10. His method kept new purchases, as such, out of sight, that is, hidden from my mother. She says now that she knew what he was up to, so Dad's system was less subterfuge and more simply avoiding scrutiny by keeping the collection neat and orderly and not contributing to clutter. My system works well for me as a way to optimize across both accommodation space and accessibility. If I had unlimited space and could optimize for accessibility, I'd want something more like you see in record stores and radio stations, or at least the only radio station I'm familiar with, where the records are in bins or coffins that are browsable from above and in front, so that I could flip through my records and browse the full album cover. That kind of scheme takes up a lot of space, at least if all the records are browsable, because they can't be stacked. I would also worry that such a system would damage the records and outer sleeves in the long term, since a substantial fraction of records' weight would be borne by records further back in the coffin. Ideally, records should be stored vertically and only as tightly packed as necessary to keep them all vertical. Leaning records against one another is probably okay in the short term, but could promote warping and sleeve wear in the long term. Here's what I'd like to do with mine. I'd keep almost all of them in cabinets stacked too high, and keep the heavy rotation in shallow bins on top of the cabinets. As the heavy rotation bins approached full capacity, I'd have another pair of cabinets built. Please, share your own system in the comments. Before I leave the subject of cabinets, I'll point out a great feature of these. Each one has a base that greatly enhances its resistance to bending or sagging under the load of all that vinyl. Records are heavy, and the flexural rigidity of plywood sheets is finite. That rigidity is increased substantially by the vertical members of the base. Whew. How do I buy records? Of course, you can and should do what you want. But I only buy records in physical brick-and-mortar stores. Offhand, I can only think of 2 exceptions. That is, I think I've only bought 2 records by ordering them and having them shipped. What's up with that? What about the records I want but can't find in stores? Again, do what you want, but I've just never ordered records except in special circumstances. I want to say that ordering records seems like cheating, but that's not it. If my record buying wants and priorities were coherent enough to enable buying online, then I'd also be more amenable to streaming music online. So whereas I may have a few records that I'm especially looking out for when I visit the store, I'm generally making yes or no decisions about every record in the store. That's right. My general practice is to flip through every record in the store. I might skip through some sections or subsections, and there are certainly times when I hit only a few sections, but my general practice is to flip through all the records and pull what I want as I go. Do I pull every record I want? No, of course not. I only pull what I want to buy that day. But what if it's not there next time? Oh well. A drink to the lost record. Here's an example. I bought In a Glass House by Gentle Giant a couple of years ago. If you're not familiar, that record was never released in the US, and true fans had to find imported copies. I saw this record twice in record stores and bought it the second time. The first time was in West Berlin in 1983. I didn't buy it because it just didn't make the cut that day. I didn't see that record again until 2 years ago, when I was in one of my local record stores, and 2 of the guys were talking about a collection they'd just bought. I heard one of them say something about a lot of prog, so I asked whether the collection included In a Glass House. Yeah, I think so. Let's see. Here it is. Do you want it? Yes, I did. The records in my collection do not exactly map my musical preferences. My records are those that I found, wanted, and could afford on one of my visits to the record store. Finding records is fun, even thrilling, and some choices are whimsical. I have records I've only listened to once, although I give almost all of them more chances than one. Some I end up liking and playing a lot, and others less so. Choosing records by hand in physical stores feels right to me, and I recommend my method, if you can call it that, but you should do what you want. Finally, how do I care for my records? And do I recommend you follow my example? I'll work my way from outside in. I do not buy plastic outer sleeves to protect the cardboard outer sleeves. and I remove the shrink wrap from new records. If I buy a record that's already in a plastic outer sleeve, I generally keep the record in that sleeve, but I don't buy new plastic sleeves. Yes, some of the outer sleeves have become worn, and my copy of Outlandos d'Amour contains elements of Regatta de Blanc, and maybe vice versa. But that's probably due to shipping rather than storage. If I were going to ship all or a substantial part of my collection, I would consider buying plastic outer sleeves. I wouldn't discourage you from buying and using protective outer sleeves, but I don't think they're necessary if your records are stored vertically and not overly smushed. If my records spent more time leaning heavily on one another, then I could see the utility of protective outer sleeves. Okay? Okay. Some of you are probably horrified right now. My dad never used plastic outer sleeves, and my dad had a lot of records. Predominantly, the records that I inherited from his collection are in excellent condition. I do buy archival quality inner sleeves, but I don't transfer my new records to those sleeves right away. I do intend to wash all of my records, but that's a long-term goal because I have a lot of records. After washing, I put the clean records in the new inner sleeves. If the old inner sleeves aren't special, I throw them away. The new inner sleeves help prevent accumulation of static charge and dust, both of which washing does remove, by the way. The new inner sleeves also signify that the record has been washed. Otherwise, it would be too difficult to keep track of which ones I've washed. I dust the surface with the special carbon fiber brush and brush off the stylus before playing each side. I occasionally, if somewhat irregularly, clean the stylus thoroughly with a cleaning solution. I've had this same little bottle of Audio-Technica cleaning solution since the 80s. Get some of this stuff. If you keep your stylus clean, you may never need to replace it. Whoa, what? Where the heck did I come up with that bit of misinformation? From two people in two different stores who sold new styli. They said they'd never seen a stylus that was actually worn out. They'd only seen styli that were dirty and or had accumulated a layer of vinyl residue. This cleaning solution removes both. I've been using the same stylus since the 80s. I want a new stylus, but not because the old one is worn out, but rather because I want one that's better suited to my tone arm. I never handle my records by touching the surface, even near the edges. Rather, I touch only the edge and the label. I try to use the same familiar set of motions to remove a record from its inner sleeve and to replace it. Sticking to routine reduces the risk of mishandling and damage. Yes, I've dropped records. Ugh. I usually use my turntable's automatic play feature. Or at least the cueing button or lever, to minimize the chance of scratching the record surface with the stylus. Every time I set down or lift the stylus manually, I risk mishandling the stylus and scratching the record. Yes, I've done that. Ugh. I do rip my vinyl to FLAC files. FLAC is lossless compression. I only rip records I've washed. So, one advantage of CDs is that they make it onto my hard drive more quickly. I recommend you think of your records as things you'll have and enjoy for the rest of your life, and act accordingly to ensure that they remain in good condition indefinitely. I don't recommend you obsess over that condition, especially when purchasing. If you get a record in poor enough condition to annoy you, then replace it with one in better condition, or even a CD. I haven't felt the need to replace many records. One exception is the first one I ever bought. Foxtrot by Genesis. For most, maybe all, of the time I owned it, it skipped at the beginning of side 1. Plus, it was a cutout, that is, remaindered copy with no gatefold. I replaced it with a near-mint gatefold copy in the early 90s. Don't sweat it if your records aren't perfect. Sweat it if they skip, but don't worry about pops and clicks. If you can't not be overly annoyed by pops and clicks, you probably shouldn't buy records. Just saying. Bottom line, play your records and enjoy them. That's what they're for. Enjoy the music. Enjoy the album art. If you want to chase down the most amazing pressing of an amazing record, do that if it brings you joy. But I don't recommend that you buy records as an investment, expecting to sell them one day at a profit. Records are for playing, and they will suffer some degradation with time and use. Of course, you should try to prevent wear and damage. I said that. Just don't let obsessing over preservation keep you from enjoying your records. But look, what I've said, these are my opinions. What I do, these work for me. You do whatever brings you the most joy. Or whatever. You do you. I'm just an old second-generation record head. I don't do exactly as my father did, but I learned from him. I'll finish with reminiscence. When I was in high school, my father and I had a routine. The new comic books came in on Wednesday. So every Wednesday, on the way home after I picked him up from work, after my swim practice, we'd stop first at the comic book store, which also sold used books. And then we'd go across the street to the record store, which primarily sold used records. While I chose my comic books, he'd browse the mystery and detective paperbacks. At the record store, I'd browse the rock, while he browsed the classical and jazz sections. At each store, he'd lend me the money and pay, and not expect I'd ever pay him back. Neither of us ever kept track of the money he lent me that way. That was our thing and our secret. I knew and never told Mom about the records shipped to the office. After he died and my brothers and I found records still in his office, I was amused but not surprised, and told my brothers how he would smuggle the records home a few at a time. Cheers, Dad. I hope you enjoyed the video, maybe even found it useful. If you did, give it a like, give me a subscribe. Have a great day, and I will talk to you soon. Do you love records? 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 Okay. I gotta get a different bulb. It was crap. It was crap. It was crap. It was crap.